You ever have one of those moments when you look back and think, how did I get here? I don't mean the usual life stuff. I'm talking about those pivotal, unexpected moments when everything shifts, but you didn't even realize it was happening. The kind that leave you with more questions than answers, and a knot in your stomach that never quite goes away. It's funny, really, how we grow up expecting things to follow a certain path. You start out with the belief that the world is simple, and that everything is either something you know or something you can easily learn. But I wasn't prepared for the unknown. I wasn't prepared for the quiet, persistent shift that comes with finding something you can't explain. Something you can't unsee, unhear, or forget. This story starts where most others would end, with a group of kids too old to still believe in the boogeyman, but too young to understand what true fear was. We were between childhood and the precipice of something darker, and we weren't yet jaded enough to think that the old stories about the woods and the church weren't true. We lived in a town that looked like any other, perfectly ordinary. A row of houses with freshly manicured lawns, the smell of cut grass filling the air during the summer. Nothing special, nothing out of place. It was the kind of place where you could walk around for hours and still feel like you knew every single corner. But there were places you didn't go. Places that were just off limits. Not because anyone told you to stay away, but because you could feel it. You didn't need to be told where not to wander, you just knew. One of those places was the church on the outskirts of town. You couldn't really see it from the main roads, but if you took the back trails, there it was. Standing alone at the top of a hill, almost like it had been abandoned on purpose. The first time I saw it, I was a kid, too young to understand what it was, but old enough to feel its presence. It was strange, this building. The stone was dark, like it had been touched by something that hadn't washed off in 100 years. The windows were broken, or maybe shattered. Who knew? Nobody in town had been there in years. But it wasn't just the church that was unsettling. It was the path to it. The woods surrounding it. The way the trees bent unnaturally toward the hill, like they were reaching for the place, pulling you in without a word. And if you stood still long enough, you could hear it a hum, barely noticeable at first, but always there, like the church was alive. Alive in a way that felt wrong. It wasn't a sound you could easily describe. It wasn't wind, it wasn't animals, it wasn't even the distant rumble of thunder. No, it was something else, something unnatural, and that hum, it tugged at the back of your mind, almost like a reminder that there were things in this world you weren't meant to understand. I spent years trying to ignore it, years walking past it, pretending it wasn't there. But you can only block things out for so long. Eventually, they have a way of creeping in. That's when I found myself standing at the edge of the woods, staring at the dark, looming figure of the church. I wasn't alone. Of course, I never would have gone up there by myself. My friends were there too. Martin, Jessica, and Luke, you've heard of them. Every town has kids like them. The ones who never fit in, but also never cared. The outcasts, the rebels. You know the kind. The ones who'll do anything just to feel like they belong, even if that means heading into the darkness just to prove they're not afraid. At least, that's what I thought it was at the time. We weren't scared. Not really. We were curious. The kind of curiosity that makes you wonder if there's something more to the stories. Maybe something you were meant to find out. Maybe something we were all just too afraid to admit. I should have listened to my gut. We met at the foot of the hill, the church barely visible through the dense trees. It was late afternoon, the sun hanging low enough to cast long, twisted shadows that seemed to stretch out toward us. The wind picked up, just enough to rustle the leaves, and I could hear that hum again, louder this time, more insistent. We paused, standing just out of reach of the church, but not close enough to see what waited beyond those broken doors. Martin, of course, was the first to speak. His voice broke the silence, cutting through the tension like a knife. "Let's just get this over with," he said, his tone flat, as if he was too tired to care about anything anymore. I don't know why, but that made everything feel heavier. It wasn't the words. It was the way he said them, like he'd already given up on any kind of answer, like the church and its mysteries were just another thing to conquer. Jessica, however, was different. Her smile was wide, almost too wide, as if she had something to prove. "Come on," she urged, "let's just go. We'll see what all the fuss is about." I had to admit I was intrigued. But even as I stepped forward, my heart began to pound in my chest, loud enough that I thought Martin, standing behind me, could hear it. We made our way up the overgrown path, the earth beneath our feet soft and uneven. Every step felt like we were walking through a fog that hadn't quite settled yet. The church loomed closer, And as we approached, I could feel the air change. The weight of something unseen pressed down on us. The hum, I could hear it clearer now, coming from the church itself, vibrating in the pit of my stomach. It wasn't just a sound, it was a presence, an entity, almost as if the church had a heartbeat of its own. A strange, rhythmic pulsing that seemed to draw us in, pull us closer. But as I stepped forward, I paused. I looked over at the others. Martin's face was unreadable. Jessica, still smiling, but the smile was thinner now. Luke was silent, his eyes scanning the surroundings like he was trying to find an escape route. This is where it gets real, I thought. Because when you step into something that feels this wrong, you can't just turn around. The stories were true, every single one of them. But there's something else. Something I didn't realize until we were halfway through the door, feeling the cold air of the church sweep over us. It wasn't that we were the ones walking into the darkness. No, that was the thing. The church was already waiting for us. It was the one walking toward us. And we had just opened the door. The moment we stepped over the threshold of the church, the atmosphere shifted. The air inside was different. Heavier, colder, like stepping into a forgotten room that had been sealed for decades. It wasn't just the temperature, though it was the way the silence clung to us. It felt oppressive, as though the very walls were listening, waiting for us to make a sound. There were no windows, only small slits in the stone, and they let in just enough light to barely illuminate the interior. The dust in the air was so thick it seemed to shimmer in the weak light, and each breath felt like inhaling something that didn't belong in my lungs. I should have known we weren't alone. Even then, in the back of my mind, I could feel it, like an itch that wouldn't go away, a presence. I didn't want to believe it, but that hum had only grown louder now, resonating through the very foundation of the church, vibrating in the floor beneath our feet. The walls seemed to tremble with it, as if they were alive, responding to something we couldn't see. The sound itself was indescribable, something between a low growl and the deep rumble of thunder, but more insidious, as though it was calling to us in ways we couldn't comprehend. I looked over at Jessica. She was still smiling, though her eyes didn't match her expression. She looked too eager, like she was trying to convince herself that nothing was wrong. Luke was staring at the altar at the far end of the church, his face pale, his gaze locked in place, and Martin looked tired. More tired than I'd ever seen him. The usual bravado that made him the leader of our group had vanished, and in its place was something that looked like dread. "We shouldn't be here," Luke whispered, his voice low, almost drowned out by the strange vibration in the air. His eyes flicked nervously around the room, but he didn't move. The tension was palpable. You could feel it, a pressure that seemed to settle on your chest and refuse to lift. It wasn't just fear. It was something far worse, something more primal. "You guys hear that?" Martin asked suddenly, his voice rough, his eyes darting around the room. It's coming from behind the altar." But none of us said anything at first. We all heard it, though. That sound, the same rumbling that had started when we'd first approached the church, but now it was deeper. Almost like it was coming from beneath us, not from the walls. It felt like the whole church was breathing, as if it had a life of its own, a hunger that couldn't be satiated. I felt it in my bones, the way it reverberated through the ground, through my legs, making everything feel unstable. Like the church was a living thing, trying to pull us in, force us to come closer. "You don't think," Jessica began, her voice trailing off. She didn't need to finish the sentence. We all knew what she was thinking. The stories, the rumors, the whispers in town about the church being more than just abandoned. That it wasn't just empty, it was waiting for something or someone. I wanted to leave. I don't think anyone could say they didn't. But something kept us there, held us in place like invisible hands. We weren't even looking at each other anymore. We were all looking at the altar, drawn to it as if it held the answers to everything we had been wondering about this place. As if it was calling to us, beckoning us forward. Slowly, cautiously, we moved toward it. The air grew colder as we stepped closer, the hum intensifying, pulsing with a rhythmic energy that matched the beat of my own heart. It was like the church was alive, and it wanted us to hear it, to feel it. My throat tightened as we approached the altar, and I could see that the others felt it too, the oppressive weight that seemed to press against us, forcing us to move forward. Then I saw it. At first, it was nothing more than a shadow in the corner of my vision, something that flickered just out of reach. But when I looked again, I saw it clearly. A door, hidden behind a heavy set of curtains that had been pulled shut, completely unnoticed before. A door I had never seen on any map of the church, nor mentioned in any of the town's rumors. A door that shouldn't be there. Not in a place this old. I reached for it before I could stop myself, my hand instinctively grasping the cold metal of the doorknob. My fingers went numb the moment I touched it, and I had to fight the urge to pull away. But it was too late. The door swung open with an agonizingly slow creak, and the sound that filled the air was something I'll never forget. It wasn't a scream. It wasn't even a growl. It was the sound of something much worse, a silence suddenly broken. A feeling of pure, suffocating darkness poured out from the doorway, and with it came the sense of something else. Something ancient. Something hungry. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach, that raw, instinctive fear that I hadn't known was capable of such intensity. The kind that makes your hair stand on end, that freezes your blood, that makes you wish you'd never stepped into that room. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. The door was wide open now, and the air behind it was so cold it burned. The hum from the church intensified to a deafening roar, and suddenly, it wasn't just the walls shaking. It was the ground. The very earth beneath our feet seemed to tremble as if the church itself was about to tear itself apart. Jessica was the first to scream, and then the lights went out. Everything went black. For a long moment, there was nothing but the sound of our breathing. Then, faintly, a low whisper echoed from the depths of the church, a voice that wasn't ours, a voice that didn't belong to anyone in the room. You shouldn't have come. It was the last thing we heard before the darkness swallowed us whole. The darkness that followed wasn't like any darkness I'd ever known. It wasn't just the absence of light, it was a presence. Heavy, thick, pressing down on us from all sides. It wrapped around me like a suffocating blanket, every breath a struggle. I could feel the weight of it on my chest, like something was sitting on top of me, but I couldn't see it. I couldn't see anything. My fingers tingled, numb from the cold that poured from that unseen room. The hair on my neck prickled with the sensation of being watched, of being studied. I couldn't even hear my friends breathing anymore. The sound of the church, the hum, the rumble, was gone. All that was left was the silence and the faint, chilling whisper that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. You shouldn't have come. I tried to move, tried to call out, but my throat had drawn dry like the air had sucked all the moisture out of my lungs. I felt like I was suffocating from the inside out. My hands went instinctively to my pockets, searching for something, anything, but there was nothing there. No phone, no flashlight, nothing but the overwhelming pressure of the dark. And then I felt it. A hand. Cold, slick, brushing against my shoulder. I whipped around, my heart slamming against my ribs, but there was nothing. Just the void stretching out into infinity. For a second, I thought I'd imagined it. Thought maybe the fear was getting to me. But then it happened again. This time, it wasn't just a brush. It was a grip, a freezing hand wrapping around my arm, pulling me toward the unknown. I couldn't stop it. My feet were moving of their own accord, like they were being dragged forward against my will. Guys, I gasped, but my voice was swallowed by the darkness. I couldn't hear anything, not even the faintest sound of movement. Just the hollow emptiness pressing in on all sides. I was being pulled forward, deeper into the church, toward the door I'd opened, the door that had started it all. I tried to fight it, tried to dig my heels into the floor, but the pull was relentless. It was like the air itself was dragging me, like the very building was alive, hungry. The cold in my bones made it hard to think, but I could feel it deep down. That knowing, primal fear. Whatever was behind that door, it wasn't going to let me go. And then I heard it, the first scream. It came from Jessica. It was high-pitched, frantic, full of terror, and it echoed through the blackness. It sounded so far away, like she was miles from me, but I knew she couldn't be. She had been right beside me just moments before, but now she was somewhere else entirely. Her scream echoed again, and this time, I could hear something else, scraping, something sharp, something jagged, dragging across stone. Jessica, I yelled, straining against the pull, but the darkness swallowed my voice. No one answered. The pull grew stronger, and before I knew it, I was at the door, the same door that had been beckoning us all this time. It stood open now, wider than before, revealing a dark hallway that seemed to stretch on forever. I could feel it. Something was down there, something that had been waiting for us, something that wanted us to come closer. I didn't want to go, but I had no choice. I stepped forward, my legs moving against my will, my body frozen in place except for the relentless pull that seemed to emanate from the darkness itself. With every step, the silence grew heavier, more suffocating. It was as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for me to take the next step. I reached out for the doorframe, trying to steady myself, but my fingers brushed against something wet. I recoiled, my heart hammering in my chest, but I couldn't move away. The darkness was all around me now, It was closing in, squeezing the breath from my lungs, and all I could do was go forward. I stepped inside. The hallway stretched out before me, a tunnel of nothingness. The walls were made of rough stone, cracked and weathered by time, but they were damp slick. Almost alive, the faint smell of mildew and decay filled the air. The further I walked, the heavier the silence became, and the further away Jessica's screams seemed to drift. I could barely remember what she had sounded like now. It was as though the dark had swallowed her too. And then I saw it. At the end of the hallway, faintly illuminated by the dim light that filtered through cracks in the stone, was a shape. A figure. It was standing still, its back to me, but I knew. It was waiting for me. It was tall, too tall for a human. Its form jagged and wrong, like it was made of the shadows themselves, the edges constantly shifting and folding into one another. It was impossible to focus on, but the feeling it gave off was all too clear: hunger. The whisper returned, louder this time, filling my head, drowning out everything else. "You shouldn't have come." I reached for my phone, hoping to shine some light, but I realized too late that it was gone, along with everything else I had. No flashlight, no hope, just me and whatever that thing was at the end of the hall. I wasn't sure if I was walking toward it or if it was moving toward me. But there was no escaping it. There was no running. There was only the cold, oppressive dark and the crushing weight of the silence. Then the thing turned, and it smiled. I don't know how I managed to run. The instinct, the adrenaline, it was enough to make my feet move even though my mind screamed at me to stop. I didn't look back, couldn't look back. I just ran, stumbling through the dark hallway, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my heart pounding in my ears. But the darkness was always there, following me, pressing against my back. And I realized, with a sickening certainty, that I wasn't running away from it. I was running toward it. The hallway was endless. The door I had come through was gone. The church had become a maze of corridors, all twisting in on themselves, looping back, and I couldn't find a way out. Every turn led me deeper. Every step brought me closer. And all the while, that whisper, "You shouldn't have come," echoed in my mind. I wasn't sure when it happened, when my footsteps stopped, when my breath slowed. But at some point, I stopped running. I knew there was no point. There was no escaping it. The church had taken me, and now I was part of it. Somewhere, in the deep shadows, something smiled.